This commenter asks, I'm also curious about force-free concepts. How do I manage a dog's behavior of using tools when it considers every tool aversive? Putting on the harness is triggering, then pulling on the leash is triggering. Confining them to a crate to prevent chewing is triggering. So this is a great question, and I think one that is very common when folks are not familiar with what behavior therapy looks like, which why would you be unless you have been through this journey before? The details are going to depend on the individual dog, the environment, what is accessible and sustainable to the human, the resources that are available. But let's take a broad look at what behavior therapy looks like when the dog finds everything triggering. So the first step is holistic stress reduction. I specialize in working with chronically dysregulated dogs, dogs with anxiety disorders, trauma disorders, hyperarousal disorders, and they often have complex behavior needs and find a lot of things triggering. Often life is currently a stress event for these dogs. That means that stress levels are higher than ideal. Acutely, but also chronically. Often baseline stress levels are higher than ideal, so they have a smaller window of tolerance for dealing with stress. These dogs often have comorbid health concerns, often dealing with chronic pain or allergies or GI issues that are further narrowing that window of tolerance. Because they are never truly in a rest and digest type of state, they have trouble building resilience because resilience is built when our nervous system feels safe. These dogs tend to struggle with accessing coping skills either because they don't have the skills or because even if they do, they're not in the brain that allows them to use them. These dogs are often sleep deprived. They are often trigger stacked. So the first thing we need to do is take a holistic look at how we can reduce stress. Safety comes first, then skill building. And a holistic look means that we are looking well beyond the things that are most aversive to us or seem stickiest to us. So in this stage of things, I'm not trying to get the dog to feel good about the leash or the harness. I'm avoiding using the leash or the harness. If my dog doesn't feel safe in a crate, I'm getting creative and imaginative and finding other ways to manage the chewing. And I'm recognizing that that chewing for this type of dog is an attempt to cope with stress. And it's actually a great way to attempt to cope with stress because chewing is one of the 3 main behaviors in our calming trifecta that lowers stress on a physiological level. I'm also taking a serious look at the potential for health concerns. I'm looking at sleep hygiene. I'm looking to see how I can help the dog feel safer in the environment they're in and safer in the relationships that they're in. I'm looking at how we're attempting to meet their mental enrichment needs, their physical enrichment needs, their species typical enrichment needs. And I'm modifying them to be appropriate for the dog's stress levels. And I'm ensuring that these activities are actually supporting my dog. So I'm not trying to exhaust them on fetch, for example. These dogs are already exhausted, although they are often mistaken for being hyper-aroused and having energy to burn. So the first thing that I'm doing is changing the environment and changing what I'm doing to get my dog out of this state of chronic hyper-arousal, of sympathetic nervous system activation. Nervous system dysregulation is a medical issue and often benefits hugely from maintenance medications. Maintenance medications, mental health medications, lower the baseline stress levels, increase resilience to stress, and allow the dog to be in a brain that allows them to access coping skills. So that is often a huge part of behavior work. These medications are not sedating the dog or changing their personality. They are literally changing the way the brain works because the brain is not working the way that it's ideally supposed to work, which is why the dog is in this activated state of fight or flight. These are dogs with anxiety disorders diagnosed by a veterinarian, trauma disorders diagnosed by a veterinarian, hyperarousal disorders diagnosed by a veterinarian. These are medical conditions. But maintenance medications take 4 to 8 weeks to begin working effectively. For dogs who are struggling to get enough sleep, they are sleep deprived. For dogs who are hitting the red zone multiple times a day, and environmental management on its own, which is a whole rabbit hole to dive into, is not sufficient for the dog's health and well-being, we may be using event medication in the interim to help them get that appropriate sleep, to prevent these panic attacks, these fight or flight responses. Through this process, I'm also reducing stress by increasing the dog's agency, which can be a tricky thing to figure out how to do when we are also restricting things so the dog is less stressed. It can be helpful to work with a behavior consultant who's practiced at doing this. But we have to increase agency, increase choice, increase communication. That is well documented to reduce stress, increase resilience. So we're looking at management, we're looking at enrichment, which includes physical health, safe places, safe people, agency, sleep hygiene. And then we're looking at behavior modification. And that is simply the task of breaking down the criteria so that the dog can be in their learning brain while exposed. So if I have a dog who is stressed out about the leash, I might start by just going up and touching the leash and walking away randomly throughout the day. If I have a dog who's afraid of the harness, I'm definitely going to be looking at how they feel physically in their body, but I might start by just keeping the harness 3 feet off to my side while I sit down and toss treats away from myself for the dog to go and chase, seek. I'm avoiding coercion. I'm avoiding the dog feeling trapped. I'm making sure that they have agency. And I'm doing classical conditioning to change emotional responses. I'm empowering the dog through flight. I'm avoiding coercion. I'm building trust. For my dysregulated dogs, if they're pulling on leash, it is typically because they're painful in their body and it feels better to walk faster, or because they're adrenalized and their body is saying go, 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 or because they're trying to get away from something, or they're trying to move forward in sort of a fight mode response towards something, or because they're trying to get through the walk because they are not having a good time. So I'm going to figure out what's going on there related to the pulling on the leash, and we have a whole playlist on walking the dog. I'm probably going to use a longer leash. I'm going to make sure that we are in environments where the dog feels safe, where they are not adrenalized. Some of my very dysregulated clients can't go outside right now. So we might start dealing with the things that are scary outside, inside. And again, if someone isn't familiar with behavior therapy, this can be like, how do we even do that? But a good behavior consultant is going to be very, very well practiced at breaking down the criteria more finely than you might think possible. If I have a dog who is stressed out about other dogs, I might start by teaching them how to get away from things that scare them in the absence of the trigger. I'm going to make sure that they know that I can hear them when their stress just begins to build and that I will help facilitate them getting out of there if that's what they want. So they don't need to escalate. And they aren't stressed about being trapped where no one can hear them and they don't have a way to get away. I might start desensitizing them to the sound of the dogs, for example, with no actual dogs present. I might build their ability to engage in behaviors that will help lower their stress levels or self-regulate. Again, out of context, away from the trigger, where they feel safe. So the nuances are going to depend on what the individual dog needs, but that's sort of a broad look. The short answer is we need to break down the criteria more finely after establishing safety. But this certainly wouldn't be a scenario, especially when we're dealing with fear and anxiety, where we would ever want to use force or suppression. And I think this makes sense if we think about this from the human experience, if we think about psychology, basic psychology, which applies to our dogs. We tend to pretend it doesn't, but it's well documented. Mammals have very similar nervous systems. And so in the same way that if you were afraid or anxious and someone just forced you through it and gave you no choice, if you were afraid of going to the dentist and someone dragged you into the building and restrained you in the chair and gave you no way to opt out or take breaks, if no one was consulting you or listening to how you felt, your fear of the dentist would build. The relationships with those people would deteriorate. Your fear would generalize. And I could potentially be punished into not externally showing signs of distress. I could be punished into dissociating, into a freeze response, which would make it much more convenient for the people around me, while increasing my negative associations, increasing my stress levels, decreasing my belief that I can help myself, and overall tanking my mental and physical health. And this is what behavior consultants mean when they say that the amount of force you have to use in training is negatively correlated with one's skill level.